Welcome, my son, to the machine. A little Pink Floyd homage to start this week in Cleantech. Did you get that? I don't imagine producer Brian can get that tune licensed. It's probably a little expensive. This is actually a roundup of this week's biggest stories that you need to know about in climate and clean energy. We do it in 15 minutes or less, or we at least try. Today's Friday, March 7th, 2025. I'm Factor This content director Paul Gerke. This week in Clean Tech guest, 1 by 1, 2 by 2, Miss Lisa Martine Jenkins from Latitude Media. She'll be joining us shortly. That was a Mount Joy reference, more modern. You listen to Mount Joy? Mike Casey of TigerCom, Clean Tech commentator extraordinaire on the program. Did you get any of that, or am I just talking to myself?
I think it's a really good thing that John Engel does not listen to these episodes, because I think he would have opinions about how much fun you are having in his absence, my friend.
I just like to hear myself talk.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna just delay you for just a few seconds by giving a listener shout out to our friend Jan Brandt of Solar Wake Up. He posted our last episode, and if you're not a subscriber to his terrific daily news roundup, we thoroughly recommend it, Paul Gerke.
Yeah, we just want to let you know we'll do pay for play like that. We have so few shares that if you share, we'll talk about your thing that you got going on. No money exchanged. We're just friendly like that on the show with our listeners. If you want to be a part of it, you can nominate the stories we talk about too. Hit up my personal email. See, very personal vibes. paul.gerke@clarionevents.com. Also email me if I wear the same shirt a couple shows in a row again. I noticed that I had done that and nobody said anything, so I went with the Mike Casey quarter zip today, and now you're wearing a bowling shirt. What's the first story we're doing this week?
What's wrong with bowling?
I'm just bad at it.
I'm sorry you're such an elitist, but I also like bowling. All right, our first story. Christopher M. Matthews and Jenny Strasberg from the Wall Street Journal have a story, quote, Justin Peterson, the DC power broker embroiled in a global hacking scandal, Paul Gerke.
Okay, let's center. No more fun. We're talking about global hacking scandals. It's serious business. So let me take you back to 2015, a simpler time. Justin Peterson, a DC lobbyist, he worked for ExxonMobil. He met with an Israeli private investigator and initiated what prosecutors call Operation Fox Hunt. The goal was to uncover damaging information on environmentalists and Exxon's critics through hacking. While Peterson hasn't been charged, court documents obtained by the Wall Street Journal detail his alleged involvement in commissioning that operation. Those documents now part of a U.S. criminal case against that Israeli investigator, who was arrested in London and is now facing extradition to the United States for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and computer hacking. Mike, those documents allege that his work for Peterson's firm, DCI Group, involved hackers based in India. It included illegal branches of private email accounts, leaked information then shared with Exxon and the press, which Exxon later referenced as leaks in court proceedings. Excuse me. Those documents say that Peterson's DCI firm paid that Israeli investigator $16 million for his services. Mike, what do you think about all this? You do a little hacking in your recreational time?
I used to, but I finished up with that. Just a passing phase. But in case you haven't noticed, my friend, we are being asked to believe all sorts of fantastical things these days. So among them is the assertion by ExxonMobil that it did not know that its lobbyist, Mr. Peterson, took it entirely upon himself to hire an Israeli corporate spy for hire to hack into ExxonMobil critics. As I say to my teenage kids when they were still at home, I only look dumb. This is the same company that made male bovine excrement the entire world about its carbon-cutting algae fuels. The same company that ignored its internal scientist predictions several decades previous that their product would drive the global climate disruption crisis, and then funded disinformation campaigns to deny those very things. But they did not, I tell you, know their contract lobbyist was using corporate espionage on company opponents. I must admit that keeping a straight face when talking through this denial is as awkward as a cabinet meeting in North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un must be. Paul?
I need like a sound effect thing over here. Also, disinformation, real hot in the streets these days. Very popular space to be in. We try to play it straight, though, on this show. Story number two, Esha Day from Bloomberg titled Tumbling Tesla Shares Leave Investors Bracing for More Losses. When is Elmo going to go back to work, Mike Casey?
John Engel's BFF Elon Musk might have sleepless nights in Washington chainsawing his way through the federal bureaucracy, but this company, you might have heard called Tesla, it is having a rough year. Stock down 40% from its late highs in 2024, with a 17% decline just this week. Sales have slowed, particularly in Europe, when they were down nearly 50% compared to last January. Tesla's market value has now fallen below $1 trillion for the first time since November, when the stock soared after the U.S. presidential election locked in their EV advantage relative to legacy automakers. In January, the company reported a weak fourth quarter delivery numbers and the first annual drop in sales in over a decade. Mr. Gerke, your thoughts?
Mike, I think Tesla's one of those poster boys for those overinflated stocks. I think people have been talking about this and wringing hands for a really long time, that they're trading like 90 or 100x earnings compared to a lot of their peers. So there was probably some wiggle room to go downward. But also, this brand is more or less an extension of Elon Musk, and his image has changed an awful lot in recent years. He went from this esteemed technocrat genius who could launch these companies and turn anything into magic to somebody who's being called the president's best buddy on television and is now slashing jobs at federal agencies, and is basically his public image could not have taken a worse turn than where it used to stand, Mike. And nearly half of likely voters in the U.S. said they were less likely now to buy a Tesla because of the way he's been acting. And the sales are down in Europe and China too. Some investors starting to recognize Tesla as more than just a traditional car company, valuing them for their batteries. They sell more batteries than pretty much anybody. They're also pretty far along on self-driving software, Mike. We'll see where that leads them. Might be able to salvage the value of this place regardless of what Elon does, but I wonder if he's ever going back to work.
Our third story by Sammy Roth from the LA Times. It's called Time for California to Get Serious About Cheaper, Cleaner Energy. And Sammy, we want you on the show. We're not going to let up until we get you. Paul, talk about Sammy's story.
No, do you want me to just continue to ask for Sammy to be on the show? Because I can use the time for that, too. No, in the column, Roth calls out what he says is a failure of California's politicians, both rising electricity rates and the need to phase out oil and gas from the state's economy. Those two are connected, he notes. Cheaper electricity will get people to switch to EV and heat pumps faster. If you're not following what's happening in California right now, residential electricity rates rose 47% in the state just over the last 4 or 5 years. Environmental groups blaming profit-seeking utilities. The cost of wildfire mitigation efforts, like burying power lines, is also a big part of that picture. And in the background of all this, Southern California Edison just got sued by LA County, alleging that its poles and wires were responsible for the most recent fire there. It's a big mess, and everything's more expensive when you're talking about energy, Mike. What were your thoughts on this piece?
It lays out some really interesting proposed solutions. So one bill proposed in the state legislature would cap utility rate hikes and shift more wildfire liability costs to utility shareholders. Another would make it easier to import cheaper renewable energy from other states. That has been opposed historically by past labor union positions because of concerns that would shift jobs to out of state, though that approach now has their support. The state's Public Utility Commission has advocated cutting the amount that utilities compensate homeowners for the power they feed into the grid from their solar panels. This has resulted in a significant reduction in solar residential installation jobs. It's basically pulled the rug out from under people who've made an investment, expecting that they'd get a return based on their retail rate. So one bill would also tax major polluters to fund clean energy projects and the management of climate disasters, but a previous version of that bill was blocked by the fossil fuel lobby last year. Paul, our fourth story.
Story number 4 by This Week in Cleantech previous guest, Akshat Rothi from Bloomberg Zero, titled Why Almost Everyone Hates ESG Right Now. Mike, do you hate ESG?
I do not. And I think we should remember that ESG came from a European study many years ago that found that the stock of public companies that followed ESG principles performed better over time. Full stop. Those were the facts. Fast forward several years, and ESG investing is at an inflection point in the U.S., though in EU it's on a little bit better footing. Europe-based reporter Frank Schwarzkopf explains that back in 1929, there were little to no regulations for how companies reported their earnings across the globe. That lack of oversight led to unreliable reporting, which partially fueled the Great Depression. After that, financial reporting became standardized mostly in the U.S. Then ESG, or non-financial reporting, emerged decades later as a response to companies being exposed for unethical practices, such as mistreating their workers. The golden age of ESG rulemaking began in 2019 with the EU's taxonomy regs. They were used to classify businesses' sustainability for investors. The Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation followed in March 2021, requiring banks to report on ESG factors. Since then, more regulations have emerged, but face pushback from small and medium-sized companies that lack the resources to comply, leading the EU to reconsider reporting requirements. Mr. Gerke.
Yeah, so I fell asleep about halfway through that, Mike. A lot of stuff there that I didn't understand and a lot of big words. And I know that Akshat understands all of this. I suggest you go and read the article. But more or less the gist is that over time, ESG became politicized. It was framed by the fossil fuel lobby as a push by the woke left. And even before Trump's election, Wall Street quietly distanced itself from climate commitments while firms leaving those net zero groups. However, with clients in blue states, they haven't entirely abandoned ESG. We're seeing more green hushing now, companies still doing work like that, not necessarily talking about it quite as much.
Our fifth story is written by our guest, Lisa Martine Jenkins from Latitude Media. We're welcoming her on the show for the first time. Tariff havoc begins, complicating energy supply chains. We should note that shortly before taping this interview, the tariff landscape changed yet again. So, Lisa, welcome. And we want people to read your story, but if they have not yet, what's the big takeaway?
Thanks for having me, first of all. I think the main takeaway is that there are going to be major problems for clean energy as a consequence of these tariffs. And one of the biggest ones really is just uncertainty. It's really bad for business, for clean energy companies not to know what they should expect out of the business environment. And that is that's already something that's happened in the last 24 hours.
Lisa, do you think there's a case to be made for this benefiting us in any way anytime soon? Because it seems like the reading that I do is that best case scenario, maybe 3 to 5 years from now, we could start to reap some benefits of onshoring more domestic production associated with scaring off some business with tariffs. Is that the sentiment that you're gleaning, or is this just all as confusing for you and the research you've done as it is to a lot of these companies involved in this mess?
I think it's definitely confusing. I think it's definitely possible, if you look at just the way that trade normally plays out, that these have a benefit years down the road. But I think the main sentiment that I've heard from people in this space is that the short-term uncertainty is derailing things in the near term. And I don't even know if we're going to get to the point where there are benefits of onshoring clean energy manufacturing, clean energy production. Part of the energy one of the impacts of the levies is that Canadian energy resources, which includes electricity that is flowing across the border, is subject to a lower rate than all Canadian resources. It's a 10% rate rather than 25%. But Ontario is already retaliated, so they have a higher export rate. So the costs are already going up, or they already will go up kind of as a result of these tariffs. And that's definitely not something that the Trump administration wants in the short term.
Lisa, in your reporting, did you run across people who are advocating a different path to reshoring than tariffs? I'm not taking a position on tariffs for or against, but the thing you hear from tariff backers is, yes, it's a blunt instrument, but what's the other way that it actually happens? Do you hear from people who are saying X is a better way to build up domestic manufacturing than tariffs?
Yeah, well, honestly, the thing that I hear most from companies that already manufacture in the U.S. is that the Inflation Reduction Act was one of the main reasons that they moved production here. And one thing that I heard from one of my sources is that he really warned against looking at these tariffs in a vacuum. He said they're happening against this backdrop of other Trump administration actions, which includes the potential repeal of portions of the IRA. So even companies that I think would be inclined to reshore their manufacturing as a result, maybe of these tariffs, as a result, maybe of the IRA, things are so confusing right now that from what I can tell, everybody is really just in a holding pattern.
We know you'll stay on top of it, Lisa. I saw another journalist put it pretty succinctly. So far, this administration has been all sticks, no carrots.
Exactly.
Sounds like some more carrots might do us some good.
Exactly,
Well,
yeah.
Paul, we're just about out of time. We need to go to our Cleantecher of the week.
Let's do it. Cleantech of the week. Dhruv Patel, COO of Renewable Energy at McCarthy, celebrating National Energy Efficiency Day with his team at McCarthy on Wednesday, shared the experience on LinkedIn, the only social media that we're lurking on these days, right, Mike?
Yes, sir.
Shared it with the quote, but what really sticks with me isn't just the megawatts we build, it's the impact we leave behind.
Amen. Good job, Drew. Want to thank our wonderful producer, Brian Mendez, and Alex Peterson and Claire Quirin for helping gather these stories.
And for their patience, as always, as well as the patience of Lisa Martine Jenkins, who joined us on This Week in Cleantech. You know, we often give shout outs to repeat guests. We'll see if she wants to deal with us again. You'll have to subscribe, leave feedback, and share story suggestions to find out. You can also read all the articles right underneath this video on our page. Just click on the episode descriptions. The hyperlinks should all be in there. If they're not, email me and tell me they're not. I'll fix it.
Paul, I think Stephen Lacey, who was on this show a year ago, decided to push Lisa out on the plank so she'd have to get into shark-infested waters. That's my theory, and I'm sticking with it. I'll see you next week, my friend.